Hey everybody, this is Claude from the Lamest Defenders, and today I'm back to review Spider-Man Miles Morales for the PlayStation 5. After more than 2 years since the original Marvel Spider-Man game was released on the PS4, does Miles Morales hold a candle to the original web-slinger? Just like the previous review, I'm going to take a look at a few major aspects of the game: the story, the gameplay, and where I think Insomniac is headed for future Spider-Man titles. Also, I want to say there might be minor spoilers associated with this review, but I'll do my best to try and mask any of the game's big reveals. But with that being said, there will be spoilers from the 2018 game, so be prepared for that. The story takes place a year after Peter Parker foiled Dr. Octopus from unleashing the Devil's Breath bioweapon upon the city of New York, and the Hammerhead plot to turn the city into a crappy version of The Sopranos. But if you remember at the conclusion of that game, Miles Morales reveals to Peter that he was also bitten by a radioactive spider and has gained similar abilities. Since that time, Peter has been training Miles on how to use his powers and, of course, hammered down the importance of his popular motto, "With great power comes great responsibility." Now that you're caught up, the game immediately throws you into control of Miles as he and Peter are tasked with escorting prisoners back to the raft. Immediately, there's a stark contrast regarding the experience levels between Peter and Miles. It was really cool to see Insomniac Games play into that and shore up the players' sentiments that they are definitely not playing a confident Spider-Man with Miles, at least not yet. As you may already know, Peter Parker eventually leaves the keys to the city in Miles' hands, as he will be traveling with MJ as her photographer while they go overseas to cover the Symkaria Civil War. Honestly, it's a little bit abrupt, especially since it always seems that something is going down in the Marvel version of New York City. Maybe Peter Parker assumes since there are already so many superheroes in the city, Miles won't be entirely screwed. From there, the game starts to introduce you to the game's other supporting characters. You of course have Miles' guy in the chair best friend Genki, who is basically the inspiration of the MCU Ned Leeds. Their relationship is fun and believable, but my biggest gripe about the character is that when he starts to call Miles in-game, there are times when the voice actor sounds really close to Peter Parker's. It's extremely minor, but it made me do a double take. In addition to Genki, you have Miles' mom Rio, who is now running for city council. Other than Peter, she's probably my favorite supporting character within the game. All of her motivations make sense, and you can see that she's still reeling from her husband's death from the last game. You also have another supporting character with Miles' other best friend, Finn Mason, who kind of shows up out of nowhere, but her interaction with Miles in the beginning of the game is enduring. Also, if you're familiar with the comics and the excellent Into the Spider-Verse movie, you have Miles' Uncle Aaron, who makes an appearance, and you could probably already guess where that goes. Now, you can't have any superhero product without villains, right? And honestly, that's the game's Achilles heel. They're just flat out awful. You have everyone's favorite comic book villain, the Tinkerer, whose plotline basically makes no sense, but at least this person has cool tech, right? Their entire motivation seems incredibly cliche and doesn't hold a candle to the original game's villains whatsoever. And speaking of the first game, in Spider-Man Miles Morales, you also have multiple villains, albeit not as many, and the second villain is Roxxon's R&D director Simon Krieger, played by Troy Baker. And really not the dog on Baker in particular, but it just feels like he's in every video game nowadays. And in this game, he's literally just playing a depowered Homelander from the Amazon series The Boys. Now, I've read every issue of The Amazing Spider-Man and some of the newest Miles Morales comics, and when they mentioned Simon Krieger in the game, I had to look him up on the Marvel Wiki. I honestly had no clue who he was, and it seemed that the game's writers had to really dig into their long boxes to find someone so obscure and irrelevant to put in the game. Although the overall story is a bit worse than the first one, at least when it comes to the supervillain plots, I think what saves it is just the interaction with Miles and the community around him. Miles is an incredibly enduring character, but suffers from only being around for a decade in the comics rather than Peter Parker existing for over 58 years. Now to everyone's favorite part, the gameplay of Spider-Man Miles Morales. And there's a lot to cover here, and of course, it's incredibly similar to the 2018 game, albeit a few major changes. Now, starting with the web swinging, it's just as good as it ever was. Right off the bat, I feel like the game allows for faster swinging with Miles when compared to Peter when his game started off. I think Insomniac Games recognized that players are most likely experienced already and really took the training wheels off. I also really enjoyed Miles' unique animations when it comes to swinging versus Peter's. As a younger guy, it seems that Miles is really enjoying his time traversing around the city. You'll see him do crazy acrobatics and just take more risks, and I think it's awesome. I also think it was a smart and fun choice from the developers, and it really gives Miles his own unique spin on things, pun heavily intended. Now, as for the fisticuffs, it plays similarly to the original game. As Spider-Man, Miles utilizes his spider sense to quickly dodge enemy attacks and then counterattack with numerous ways to juggle the opponents. Just like with the web swinging, Miles Morales has his own unique animations when it comes to taking down baddies. You'll see him jump, sprawl, and take out his villains in a much more youthful way than Peter. But what's completely unique to Miles is that he can utilize his Venom powers and even go completely invisible to help him stand out from Peter Parker's Spidey. Now for the Venom powers, which is easily my favorite addition to the game, it just adds even more options to the players and how they want to take foes out. It's all based upon a meter that you build up from doing aerial tricks, dodging enemies, and keeping your combo count high. Once that meter is filled, you have a few different things you can do with it. There are 4 total Venom-powered abilities, and you'll unlock each as you progress through the game's story. Starting off, one option is to send Miles launching forward with an electric punch that can really put the hurt on the opponent. His second ability allows him to either launch opponents into the air or slam back down to create a small area of effect. His third choice is to rush his opponent and throw them towards a wall or even off a rooftop. And if you have the entire meter built up, Miles can use his last Venom ability, which unleashes a powerful explosion that can hit multiple enemies and instantly KO them. But it's not just Venom powers that makes Miles stand out. He also will gain the ability to go invisible. Once you activate the power, it will slowly drain over time before enemies can see you. Once it's drained, there's a short recharge period before you can use it again. Admittedly, I didn't use his power too much as it just felt a tad bit overpowered, especially during the stealth sections. It just felt like my get out of jail free card if I ever messed anything up. But it can definitely be handy for newer players who are struggling with some of the game's stealth challenge modes. But besides using his Venom and invisibility powers, Miles also has access to a few gadgets just like Peter Parker did in the first game. He has 4 in total, and they pretty much act exactly like the original Spider-Man's tools. Of course, Miles has access to his web shooters, which he can use to pin fallen foes out of the fight, hollow drones, which can help even the odds in case Miles is surrounded by enemies, a gravity well projectile that will suck in opponents just like Star-Lord's did in the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and finally, my favorite, a remote mine which you can stick on different panels or scenery, which lures bad guys in before knocking them out. And just like the original 2018 game, all these tools can be upgraded. All in all, I just had a lot of fun mixing these gadgets together with Venom attacks and the invisibility powers just to see what hijinks would unfold. Taking a look at the mission variety you'll find in the main campaign, you'll be tasked with fighting Tinker's high-tech criminal army, the Underground, and also tussle with Roxxon forces. Both enemy groups are really fun to fight, and both have unique units that can put Miles-specific abilities to the test. For example, Roxxon has an enemy that can scan the environment, which can knock Miles out of his invisibility and can alert nearby enemies. My favorite gameplay moment throughout the entire campaign was when Miles faced off against a Rhino earlier in the game. You're teaming up with Peter while trying to stop the giant Russian while minimizing collateral damage around Christmas time. It's a classic Spider-Man mission and was definitely a highlight. But besides the campaign missions, there's also a variety of other activities Miles can take part in New York City. He has side missions such as a quest to rescue a cat named Spider-Man, who you can eventually unlock as a costume, kind of like a pseudo sidekick where he's perched in Miles' backpack. And that's just one example. There's plenty of other side missions that I don't want to spoil here, but none of them are as involved as a cat rescue mission. In addition, just like in the first game, Miles can find random collectibles such as time capsules, which he and Finn hit around the city. There are also challenges that Pete put around the city which test Miles' combat, stealth, and traversal skills. Oh, and you also have random crimes that pop up around the city, just in case you're bored. Needless to say, New York City definitely feels just as alive as the 2018 game. And while you're completing side missions, clearing out hideouts, and gathering hidden collectibles, you'll be earning tokens that you can use to upgrade your gadgets and suits. And speaking of suits, the game features 19 costumes that the player can unlock. Now, not all of them are winners, and most of them are based on variant covers or featured very briefly within the comics. But even if the costumes aren't the most exciting of choices, they all look great running on both the PS4 and the PS5 versions of the game. The detail in the costumes is remarkable, and you can especially see it when you check them out in the game's camera mode. It's evident that Insomniac Games poured hours into modeling these. Even though all the costumes look wonderful, there is one that easily stands out from the rest, and that's the Into the Spider-Verse costume. The costume can be equipped with a mod that can change Spidey's frame data, where he'll move just like he did in the movie. It's literal perfection. There's also another mod which will have an animation blur pop out when you punch or kick an enemy, making the whole costume experience into a Spider-Man fan's wet dream. And since we're already talking about how great the game looks, I need to briefly dive into the game's graphics. As you probably are already aware, Spider-Man Miles Morales takes place during the holiday season, so as you'd guess, Miles would be swinging around a bitterly cold New York City with buildings covered with fresh snow. It's a stark difference from the original game where Peter was fighting crime during early October, and it's definitely a welcome one. But if you're lucky enough to somehow own a PlayStation 5, you're in for a treat. There are 3 different graphics settings: Fidelity Mode, Performance Mode, and Performance RT Mode, all which offers something unique to players. While playing on Fidelity Mode, the game runs in 30 frames per second, but features ray tracing and other visual effects. I would highly recommend this setting if you really want to show off the PlayStation 5 to your friends. And if you have a 4K enabled TV, it can honestly be jaw-dropping. But wait, there are more visual options. If you're a diehard who needs to have their games running silky smooth, the game offers a performance mode as well. Basically, all the graphical bells and whistles are turned off to give you that extremely stable 60 frames per second. Personally, the setting made the combat feel even better as everything flowed flawlessly. But if you want something a little bit more in the middle, Insomniac Games recently released a patch that added Performance RT mode for the PS5, which still lets you have that 60 frames per second and adds ray tracing along with increasing visual flares. Honestly, out of all these 3, I stuck with the Fidelity mode. It just looked too good not to have on, and playing in 30 frames per second already felt like the standard, and the gameplay felt great. Oh, I also have to mention the game's use of the PlayStation 5 DualSense controller. Basically, it really just doesn't amount to much. There's a little bit of a force feedback in the triggers when you're swinging around the city, and the controller's crappy speaker will make thwip noises as you're using your web shooters. Not exactly thrilling when compared to other games, but I'm sure in the PS5 exclusive sequel for Spider-Man, it'd be a lot better. As for any hiccups I found in the gameplay, such as glitches, I did experience one where I was stuck interacting with the infamous Pigeon NPC. It was actually pretty funny as he looked at me with his cold dead eyes. All I had to do was restart at a checkpoint and then it was fixed. It wasn't a big deal, but I just thought I would mention it. In a nutshell, Spider-Man Miles Morales still shares some of the excellent gameplay from the 2018 title, but still adds enough variety to make it stand on its own. Whether you're going full stealth mode to clear a room, or devastating anyone standing in your way with a unique venom power, the game never really feels stale at all. Throughout Spider-Man Miles Morales, I felt the creeping suspicion that any future Spider-Man games will feature online co-op now that we have 2 fully fledged Spider-Men. I'm definitely interested to see if and how they implement it, but I can only imagine how fun it'd be to play with your friends. Heck, they could even try their hand at making a Spider-Verse storyline and maybe introduce even more characters. There's plenty of places Insomniac can go. Now, as for post-release content for this specific title, Insomniac Games has yet to comment whether or not the game will receive future DLC. At this point, I wouldn't mind if we didn't get any, and they just put all hands on deck for the game's eventual sequel in a few years. Overall, Spider-Man Miles Morales just adds just enough to make it stand out from its predecessor. Although the campaign is noticeably shorter than the 2018 title, it still doesn't feel all that shorter since there's so much left to do after you finish a campaign. At $50, it's a game you really can't miss out on, even if you still own a PlayStation 4. As I mentioned earlier, I can't wait to see where the developers go next for the sequel, now that we have Miles finally coming into his own as a hero. That being said, I'm giving Spider-Man Miles Morales an 8.5 out of 10. Thanks so much for watching, and that concludes our review. If you played Spider-Man Miles Morales, let us know what you think in the comments below. Also, if you haven't already, please hit the like button to show your support and consider subscribing as we put out more Marvel-focused content in the future. And as always, don't forget to stay lane.